Imagine being at a campsite in the middle of nowhere, surrounded only by darkness and the sounds of nature. Everything feels peaceful, until suddenly you realize you're not alone. Today, we're diving into 10 terrifying camping stories accounts so disturbing, they'll make you think twice before venturing out into the wilderness. From mysterious figures lurking in the night to unexplainable noises echoing through the trees, these tales will send chills down your spine and might just make you afraid to turn off the lights. So get ready to uncover the dark side of camping with these real-life horror stories. But be warned, you may never look at the great outdoors the same way again. Story 1. The Shadow in the Clearing. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Emma, her boyfriend Jake, and their 2 friends, Sophie and Dan, had been planning the camping trip for weeks. They found an isolated spot deep in the woods, away from the usual campgrounds. It was just them, the trees, and the stars, a perfect escape from their daily grind. The first night was magical. They pitched their tents, cooked dinner over the campfire, and laughed as they shared ghost stories under the canopy of stars. The forest felt alive, its sounds blending harmoniously with their voices. It wasn't ominous, just serene, peaceful, untouched. But as the sun dipped below the horizon on their second night, Emma felt a shift. She was collecting firewood near the edge of the clearing when she saw it. A dark, human-like figure stood motionless between the trees. At first, she thought it was just a shadow cast by the fading sunlight. But as she focused, she realized it was too distinct, too defined, and then it moved. "Jake, come here," Emma called out, her voice trembling. Jake jogged over, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What's up?" Emma pointed toward the spot. "There's someone there, between the trees. Do you see it?" Jake squinted, scanning the area. "See what?" Emma blinked. The Pyongyu figure was gone. She felt a chill crawl up her spine, but forced a nervous laugh. "Never mind. I think I'm just seeing things." They returned to the campfire, where Sophie and Dan were roasting marshmallows. Emma decided not to say anything. She didn't want to ruin the night with what might have just been her imagination. Hours later, the group retired to their tents. Emma and Jake shared one, while Sophie and Dan were in another, a few feet away. The forest was unusually quiet. The usual chorus of crickets and rustling leaves had vanished, leaving an unsettling stillness. Emma lay awake, unable to shake the image of the figure in the trees. That's when she heard a faint, rhythmic tapping. She nudged Jake, who groaned and pulled the sleeping bag over his head. "What is it now?" he mumbled. "Do you hear that?" Emma whispered. Jake paused, listening. "It's probably just an animal," but Emma wasn't convinced. The sound was deliberate, steady. It wasn't the random noise of a forest creature. She slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to peek outside. The campfire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the clearing. And there, standing just beyond the light, was the shadowy figure. It was closer now, its features still obscured, but its presence undeniable. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she zipped the tent shut with shaking hands. "Jake, there's someone out there," she hissed. Jake groaned, but grabbed a flashlight and crawled out of the tent. He shone the beam around the clearing, sweeping it across the trees. Nothing. The figure was gone. "You're just tired, Emma. Go to sleep," Jake muttered, though his tone lacked confidence. But Emma couldn't sleep. The unease gnawed at her until the first rays of dawn filtered through the tent. The next morning, Emma confided in Sophie and Dan. Sophie chuckled. "You've been reading too many scary stories. It's all in your head." But Dan frowned. "Actually, I heard something last night too. Footsteps, I think. I thought it was one of you guys." Emma's stomach sank. Despite the unease, the group decided to stay one more night. They convinced themselves it was just paranoia, fueled by exhaustion and the isolation of the woods. But as the sun set that evening, a heavy tension hung in the air. They sat around the campfire, trying to laugh and talk like everything was normal. But then, the tapping returned louder this time. It echoed through the clearing, sending shivers down there. Spines, everyone froze. Jake grabbed the flashlight again, his hands shaking. "Who's there?" he shouted into the darkness. No response. Then, a rock flew into the clearing, landing with a thud just feet from the fire. Emma screamed. Jake shone the flashlight toward the direction of the noise, and that's when they all saw it. The shadowy figure stood at the edge of the clearing, taller than they'd expected, its thin, gangly frame unnerving. It didn't move, it just stood there, as though it were, studying them. "Is that a person?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake didn't answer. He grabbed a stick from the ground, his knuckles white. "Whoever you are, get out of here," he yelled. The figure remained still for a moment, then turned and bolted into the woods. But it didn't move like a person. It was too fast, too fluid, its limbs bending unnaturally. The group didn't wait to find out what would happen next. They frantically packed their gear, shoving everything into there, backpacks without care. The hike back to the car was a nightmare. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves made them jump. Emma kept glancing over her shoulder, convinced the figure was following them. When they finally reached their car, they threw their bags inside and piled in, peeling out onto the dirt road without a second thought. It wasn't until they were miles away, with the sun rising behind them, that Emma started to feel safe. But even now, the memory of that shadow haunts her. Was it just a cruel prank by some stranger? Or was it something else, something not entirely human? Emma may never know the truth, but she learned one thing. The woods may be beautiful, but they hold secrets that are better left undiscovered. Story 2. The vanishing camper. James loved the outdoors. He had been an avid camper for years, exploring remote trails and camping in places where most people wouldn't dare to go. He considered himself seasoned and fearless, often taking trips alone to escape the noise of the world. One weekend in late October, James decided to venture into the Pine Ridge Forest, a sprawling, dense woodland known for its untouched beauty and eerie silence. He had heard stories about the place, how some hikers had gotten lost and never been found, but he brushed them off as urban legends. After all, he had navigated much tougher terrains. The trip started off well. He set up camp near a crystal-clear creek surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the bubbling water and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was exactly what he had hoped for: isolation, tranquility, and a chance to clear his mind. But as the second night approached, something felt wrong. James had been enjoying the peacefulness when he noticed the forest had gone completely silent. The birds, the insects, even the gentle rustling of the trees, all of it had stopped. It was as if the entire forest had hit pause. He told himself it was natural. Maybe a predator is nearby, he muttered, though he didn't really believe it. That's when he noticed it. On the other side of the creek, just at the edge of his lantern's glow, there was a tent. A small, weathered tent that hadn't been there before. "That's strange," James murmured, staring at the tent. He hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. No hikers, no campers, no signs of human activity at all. He stood up, shining his flashlight toward it. "Hello?" he called out. No response. James hesitated. The tent looked old, its fabric faded and torn in places, as if it had been left there for years. But he was certain it hadn't been there earlier that day. "Maybe I just didn't notice it," he thought, though the explanation didn't sit right. He scanned the area again, but there were no other signs of life. No campfire, no gear, nothing. The unease lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that the tent didn't belong, that it was somehow out of place. But he told himself he'd check it, out in the morning when there was daylight. For now, he zipped up his tent and tried to sleep. But the forest didn't let him rest. James barely slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he thought he heard faint rustling coming from the direction of the tent. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to keep him awake. When he finally drifted off, he was plagued by vivid, unsettling dreams. Dreams of someone standing outside his tent, their shadow outlined against the thin fabric, just watching. By dawn, James was already up, coffee in hand, staring across the creek at the mysterious tent. The sunlight made it look even more dilapidated, its once bright colors now dull and gray. He crossed the creek cautiously, the icy water numbing his feet through his boots. As he approached the tent, he called out again. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Silence. James reached for the tent flap, his heart pounding. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But curiosity got the better of him. He pulled the flap open. The tent was empty. No sleeping bag, no supplies, just an old, moldy tarp on the ground. But the smell inside was what unsettled him most. It was faint but unmistakable, the sickly sweet stench of decay. James backed away, his pulse racing. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. Carved into the trunk of a nearby tree, in jagged, uneven letters, were the words, "DON, to look for me." The message sent a chill down his spine. Who had written it? And why? The rest of the day was a blur. James couldn't focus on anything but the tent and the cryptic message. He packed up his belongings, intending to cut his trip short. But by the time the sun began to set, he realized he wouldn't make it back to his car before dark. He'd have to endure one more night in the forest. The unease was unbearable. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made his heart race. James couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Around midnight, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and circling his tent. James froze, his breath shallow. He grabbed his flashlight and knife, his hands trembling. "Who's out there?" he shouted, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own ragged breathing. Then, a whisper broke the stillness. "Why did you look?" The voice was faint, almost childlike, but it sent ice through James's veins. In a panic, he burst out of his tent, flashlight in hand. He scanned the area frantically, the beam of light darting through the trees. There was no one there. But when he turned to look across the creek, his stomach dropped. The mysterious tent was gone. James didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He sat by the dying embers of his fire, clutching his knife and flashlight, his back to a tree. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, packed up his gear, and left in a hurry. When he finally reached the parking lot, he stopped dead in his tracks. Next to his car was another vehicle, a rusted, dirt-covered relic that looked like it hadn't been driven in decades. On its windshield was a note, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "You should have left me alone." James didn't stick around to figure out what it meant. He threw his gear into his car and drove away, the tires kicking up gravel as he sped down the dirt road. To this day, James refuses to camp alone. The memory of the vanishing tent, the chilling whispers, and the cryptic note haunt him. He still wonders who or what left that warning. But deep down, he knows one thing: some places are better left unexplored. Story 3. The Whispering Tree. Lila and her brother, Sam, had always been close. Every year, they took a camping trip together, revisiting the forests they had explored as kids. This year, they chose Black Hollow Woods, a dense, sprawling forest that had been the backdrop of some of their best childhood memories. "Feels just like old times, huh?" Sam said as they pitched their tents under a massive oak tree. Its thick branches stretched out like arms, casting deep shadows over their campsite. "Yeah," Lila replied, forcing a smile. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was still, too still, and the forest seemed darker than it should have been, even with the setting sun. They spent the first evening reminiscing, laughing, over old stories by the fire. The flames danced, crackling softly as they toasted marshmallows. For a moment, Lila almost forgot about the unease gnawing at her chest. But as the fire began to die down, the forest seemed to change. The usual nighttime sounds, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, faded into an oppressive silence. The kind of silence that felt heavy, as though the woods were listening. "Do you hear that?" Lila asked, breaking the stillness. Sam raised an eyebrow. "Hear what?" "Exactly," Lila said. "There's nothing," Sam shrugged. "It's just how forests are sometimes. Don't let your imagination get the better of you." But Lila couldn't ignore the way the silence pressed down on her, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. By the time they crawled into their tents, the moon was high, casting pale light through the branches of the massive oak. Lila lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her tent, listening to the quiet. Her mind raced, every snap of a twig, rustle of fabric sending her heart into overdrive. That's when she heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. But it wasn't. The sound was too deliberate, the cadence too human. She held her breath, straining to hear. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It sounded like a single word, repeated over and over. Leave, leave. Lila's pulse quickened as she sat up and shook Sam awake. Sam, wake up. Do you hear that? Sam groaned, rubbing his eyes. Hear what? That whispering, Layla hissed. Sam sat up, frowning. He tilted his head, listening, but the woods had gone silent again. Lila, there's nothing out there, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. You're just tired. But Layla knew what she had heard. The next morning, over a quick breakfast of granola bars and coffee, Lila told Sam she wanted to leave. Are you serious? Sam said, incredulous. We just got here. I don't care, Lila snapped. Something's not right here, Sam. I heard whispering last night, and it wasn't the wind. Sam sighed, taking a long sip of coffee. Okay, how about this? Let's explore a bit today. If it still feels weird, we'll pack up tomorrow. Deal? Reluctantly, Lila agreed. They spent the day hiking through the forest, following trails that snaked between towering trees. But the unease never left Lila. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig felt like eyes watching them. By late afternoon, they stumbled upon something unusual. A tree, much like the one at their campsite, but its bark was covered in strange carvings. Symbols, crude and jagged, spiraled up its trunk, some so deep they looked like they'd been scratched into the wood with claws. Whoa, Sam said, running his fingers over the grooves. Do you think someone carved these? Lila shivered. Let's not stick around to find out. But as they turned to leave, the wind picked up, and for the briefest moment, Lila thought she heard it again, the faint whisper. Leave. Back at camp. The unease was palpable. Even Sam, who had brushed off Lila's fears, seemed quieter than usual. As night fell, the wind howled through the trees. But beneath it was something else, something almost imperceptible. Whispers. Lila and Sam sat by the fire, neither of them speaking. The flames flickered, casting shadows that danced across the bark of the massive oak. Then, without warning, the fire sputtered and died out. Did you see that? Lila whispered, clutching Sam's arm. Before he could respond, the whispering grew louder, circling them, coming from every direction. Leave, leave, leave. Sam grabbed a flashlight, his face pale. Okay, he said shakily. Maybe you're not crazy. They scrambled into their tents, zipping them shut, but the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more insistent. Lila barely slept. When dawn broke, she stepped outside to find Sam standing by the massive oak, staring at its trunk with a vacant expression. Sam, what are you doing? He didn't respond. Layla approached cautiously, her stomach twisting. That's when she saw it. Carvings, identical to the ones they had seen on the other tree, now covered the bark of the oak. What? How? Lila stammered. Sam turned to her, his face pale. His voice was a whisper. We need to leave, now. They packed in record time, their hands trembling as they stuffed gear into backpacks. As they hiked back to the car, the whispers followed them, faint and persistent, growing fainter the farther. They got from the tree. When they finally reached the parking lot, the whispers stopped. Lila turned back toward the forest one last time. The massive oak loomed in the distance, its gnarled branches stretching skyward like claws. Never again, she whispered. Sam nodded, his face grim. Never again. Story 4. The silent campsite. Tom and Clara had always enjoyed camping, but they were far from seasoned adventurers. For them, camping was more about escaping the city's noise and enjoying simple pleasures like roasting marshmallows under the stars. So when they stumbled across an isolated campsite on a forum labeled Hidden Gem, they jumped at the chance to explore it. The description promised untouched beauty, a small clearing surrounded by dense woods, and a lake nearby perfect for swimming. The only catch? It wasn't marked on official maps. Off the beaten path, the post had said. After driving for hours down winding roads and dirt paths, they finally arrived. The clearing was even better than they'd imagined, quiet, serene, and seemingly untouched. "This is perfect," Clara said, stretching her arms as she stepped out of the car. Tom nodded, already unpacking the tent. The sun was still high in the sky, casting golden light over the lush green surroundings. But as Clara glanced around, a strange thought crossed her mind. There was no sound. No birds, no rustling leaves, no buzzing insects. Nothing but the occasional crunch of their footsteps on the grass. "Do you hear that?" Clara asked, breaking the silence. Tom looked up, puzzled. "Hear what?" "Exactly," Clara said. "It's too quiet." Tom laughed, brushing it off. "You're overthinking it. Isn't this what we wanted? Peace and quiet?" Clara forced a smile, trying to ignore the unease creeping up her spine. They spent the afternoon setting up camp, cooking a simple meal over the fire, and chatting about anything and everything. By sunset, the lake shimmered like molten gold, and Clara's nerves began to settle. "This is nice," she admitted, leaning against Tom as they sat by the fire. "See? Nothing to worry about," Tom said, giving her a reassuring smile. But as night fell, the strange silence returned. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on them, making the crackling fire and their own voices seem unnaturally loud. "Do you think it's weird there are no animals around?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom shrugged. "Maybe it's just the time of year. Some animals go quiet at night." Clara wasn't convinced. When they finally crawled into their sleeping bags, Clara struggled to fall asleep. The silence was oppressive, her ears straining to catch any sound, any indication that they weren't entirely alone. Sometime in the middle of the night, she woke up with a start. She wasn't sure what had woken her, maybe a noise, maybe a bad dream, but something felt wrong. "Tom," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. Tom groaned, barely stirring. "What?" "I think I heard something," Clara said, her voice trembling. Tom sighed and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What did you hear?" "I don't know," Clara admitted. "It was like a soft tapping, or maybe footsteps." Tom grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the chilly night air. He shone the beam around the campsite, but everything was still. "There's nothing out here, Clara," he said, but his voice sounded less sure than before. The next morning, Clara found herself scanning the clearing for signs of disturbance. The fire pit looked untouched, their supplies were still neatly stacked, and the ground showed no sign of footprints besides their own. "See?" Tom said, catching her nervous glances. Nothing happened. Clara nodded, but her unease hadn't faded. Determined to make the best of the trip, they spent the day exploring the nearby trails. The forest was dense, the trees towering above them like sentinels. But as they ventured deeper, Clara began to notice strange things. Small piles of rocks arranged in unnatural patterns. Scratches on tree trunks, too deliberate to be from animals. "Tom, look at this," Clara said, pointing to a tree. Deep grooves crisscrossed the bark, almost like tally marks. Tom frowned, running his fingers over the scratches. "Weird. Maybe someone was marking a trail?" Clara didn't reply. She was too busy staring at the forest ahead. For the briefest moment, she thought she saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees. Back at camp, the unease had grown into a tangible tension. Even Tom seemed quieter, his usual cheerfulness subdued. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat by the fire in silence. The crackling flames cast long shadows across the clearing, making the trees look like twisted figures looming over them. "Do you think anyone else knows about this place?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible. Tom shook his head. "I doubt it. It's too isolated. That's why it's so peaceful." Clara didn't reply. She was staring into the forest, her heart pounding as she swore she saw something move. The fire sputtered and dimmed, as if struggling against the surrounding darkness. Then there was a sound. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from every direction at once. "Leave." Clara grabbed Tom's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Did you hear that?" This time Tom didn't laugh. His face was pale, his eyes darting around the clearing. Let's get inside the tent," he stammered. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, circling the campsite, as if an unseen presence was pacing just beyond the firelight. Clara could barely breathe, her pulse racing as the whispers turned into words. "You shouldn't be here." The tent felt suffocating, but neither of them dared to step outside. Every now and then, Clara thought she saw shadows moving against the thin fabric, like figures walking around their tent. When the sun finally rose, Clara emerged to find the campsite undisturbed, except for one thing. In the middle of the clearing, where their fire pit had been, was a single pile of rocks. It wasn't there the night before. Clara's hands trembled as she packed her things. "We're leaving, now." Tom didn't argue. As they drove away, Clara glanced back at the clearing one last time. For a split second, she thought she saw a figure standing among the trees, watching them leave. She didn't look back again. Story 5. The Forgotten Trail. Ethan wasn't an experienced hiker, but he loved the solitude of the woods. After weeks of working late nights and endless stress, he decided to spend a weekend alone in the forest. A coworker had mentioned an old, overgrown trail outside of town, a trail so rarely used, it didn't even have a name. "It's beautiful," the coworker had said. "Quiet, no tourists, no crowds, just you in the wilderness." That was exactly what Ethan wanted. He packed light, just a tent, some food, and a flashlight, and drove out to the trailhead early Saturday morning. The parking lot was empty, as he'd expected, and the air was crisp with the smell of pine. "This is going to be perfect," Ethan muttered to himself as he hoisted his backpack. The trail was narrow, winding through dense trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting shifting patterns on the ground. For hours, Ethan hiked in silence, the only sounds the crunch of his boots and the occasional rustle of leaves. By mid-afternoon, he found a small clearing that seemed ideal for setting up camp. The area was surrounded by tall trees, their trunks dark with moss, and in the center was an old fire pit made of stacked stones. "Looks like someone's been here before," Ethan mused as he dropped his pack. The fire pit looked ancient, the stones blackened from countless fires long extinguished. But what caught Ethan's attention was something carved into one of the stones, a symbol he didn't recognize. It was a simple design, almost like a spiral, but something about it made Ethan uneasy. It wasn't just the symbol itself, but the way it seemed. Fresh, as if someone had carved it recently despite the age of the stones. Shaking off the feeling, he set up his tent and gathered wood for a fire. As the sun dipped lower, the forest grew colder, and the shadows stretched long and thin. Ethan lit the fire and settled in with a book, the warmth of the flames keeping the chill at bay. But as the night deepened, the forest seemed to change. The once soothing rustle of leaves grew louder, sharper, as if the trees were shifting in the wind, except there was no wind. Ethan paused, his book resting on his lap, and listened. Snap! A twig broke somewhere behind him. He turned, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing through the trees. There was no response. Grabbing his flashlight, Ethan stood and scanned the forest. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks and undergrowth, but nothing moved. "It's just an animal," he told himself, though his hands trembled. He sat back down, but the sense of unease lingered. Ethan tried to immerse himself in his book again, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was nearby. The forest, which had felt tranquil and inviting during the day, now seemed vast and unwelcoming. The snapping twig replayed in his mind. It wasn't just the sound, but the way it had carried. Through the silence, deliberate and close. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night sky. Ethan forced himself to focus on the flames, their warmth and light providing some comfort. But then, he heard it again. This time, it wasn't a snap but a soft shuffling, like footsteps moving through leaves. Slow, deliberate. "Is someone there?" Ethan called out, his voice cracking. The sound stopped. Ethan's flashlight trembled in his hands as he shone it toward the trees. For a moment, he thought, He saw something, a shape between the trunks, dark and motionless. "Whoever it is, I'm not alone," he said, his voice louder now, trying to sound confident, but no one replied. The night dragged on. Ethan managed to convince himself to crawl into his tent, though every nerve in his body screamed at him to stay alert. As he lay on his sleeping bag, staring up at the faint outline of the tent ceiling, he tried to rationalize his fear. Maybe it had just been an animal, a deer perhaps, or even a bear. But deep down, he didn't believe it. At some point, exhaustion overtook him and he drifted into a restless sleep. Ethan woke with a start. Something was outside his tent. He froze, his breath shallow as he listened. There was a faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across fabric. "Who's there?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan reached for his flashlight, his hand trembling. Slowly, he unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam outside. Nothing. The forest was still, the fire reduced to glowing embers. But as Ethan's flashlight swept over the ground, his stomach dropped. Footprints. Clear, distinct footprints leading away from his tent into the woods. Ethan didn't sleep again that night. He sat by the smoldering fire, clutching his flashlight and knife, his eyes darting around the clearing. When the first rays of dawn finally broke through the trees, he packed up his gear and record. "Time. I'm not staying here another night," he muttered to himself, his voice shaky. But as he prepared to leave, something caught his eye. On the stone with the strange carving, a new mark had appeared. It was fresh, the grooves sharp as if they'd just been etched into the surface. A single word. "Stay." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. His hands trembled as he threw his gear into his backpack and bolted for the trail. But as he hiked back toward the trailhead, the forest didn't feel the same. It was as if the trees had grown denser, the path narrower. Every turn looked unfamiliar, every shadow more menacing. Ethan's heart raced as he stumbled over roots and branches, his flashlight flickering. It was as though the forest itself was trying to keep him there. When he finally burst into the parking lot, the sight of his car felt like a lifeline. He didn't stop running until he was inside, the doors locked, his chest heaving. As he started the engine and drove away, he glanced. In the rearview mirror one last time, standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line, was a figure. It didn't move, it didn't follow, but Ethan knew it was watching him. Story 6. The lake that calls Mia wasn't much of a camper, but when her friend suggested a weekend trip to the remote Blackwater Lake, she reluctantly agreed. The lake was infamous for its isolation, tucked deep into the forest with no cell service and no nearby towns. "It'll be fun," her friend Elena had said, grinning as she tossed a sleeping bag into Mia's car. "Just us, nature, and a few drinks by the fire." Mia had smiled back, though unease had already settled in her stomach. Something about Blackwater Lake's reputation made her nervous. Over the years, she'd heard whispers about disappearances, campers who had gone missing without a trace. Locals avoided the area, dismissing it as cursed or haunted. "It's just stories," Mia muttered to herself as the car bumped along the dirt road leading to the lake. But as the dense forest swallowed the vehicle, her doubt began to creep back. By the time they arrived, the sun was sinking low, casting the lake in hues of orange and gold. The water was unnervingly still, like glass, reflecting the surrounding trees with perfect clarity. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Elena said, stepping out of the car and stretching. Mia nodded, though the lake's stillness unsettled her. Not a single ripple disturbed its surface, and the silence around them felt heavy, almost oppressive. "Come on," Elena called, snapping Mia out of her thoughts. "Let's set up camp before it gets dark." The pair found a flat spot near the water's edge and pitched their tent. Elena was cheerful and chatty, humming to herself as she gathered firewood. But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. As night fell, the lake seemed to transform. The water, so serene during the day, now looked like a black void. The surrounding forest was pitch dark, the tall trees casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. Mia and Elena sat by the fire, their laughter carrying through the quiet night. But as the hours passed, the laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. "Do you hear that?" Mia asked suddenly, her voice low. Elena looked up, frowning. "Hear what?" Mia tilted her head, straining to listen. "It's like humming. Faint, but it's coming from the lake." Elena laughed nervously. "You're imagining things." But Mia wasn't so sure. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering light on Mia's anxious face. She couldn't stop glancing toward the lake, its black surface unnaturally still in the moonlight. "I'm not imagining it," Mia insisted, her voice firm. "There's a sound, Elena. It's faint, but it's there." Elena sighed, setting down her mug of hot cocoa. "All right, fine," she said, standing up. "Let's check it out. Maybe it's a frog or something." Mia hesitated, but followed as Elena grabbed a flashlight and walked to the water's edge. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the glossy surface of the lake. The humming grew louder. Mia froze. It was faint but distinct, a low, melodic vibration that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Do you hear it now?" she whispered. Elena's smile faltered. "Okay, that's weird," she admitted. The two stood in silence, staring at the lake. The sound seemed to grow in intensity, a hypnotic hum that made Mia's chest feel heavy. "Let's go back to the fire," Elena said quickly, pulling Mia by the arm. Back at the campsite, Elena tried to laugh it off. "Maybe it's just the wind," she suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. Mia didn't respond. She kept her eyes on the lake, her mind racing. The hum wasn't natural, she was sure of it. As the night dragged on, the sound faded, leaving an unsettling quiet in its place. Elena eventually crawled into the tent, muttering something about being tired. But Mia stayed awake by the fire, unable to shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Hours passed. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound the occasional pop of the dying fire. And then, Mia heard it again. The hum was louder this time, resonating in her chest like a low vibration. She stood up, her heart pounding. "Elena," she called softly, but there was no response from the tent. The sound seemed to pull her toward the lake. Her feet moved on their own, her body feeling strangely light as she approached the water's edge. The humming was deafening now, almost like a song. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, filling her mind with an overwhelming sense of calm and dread. The surface of the lake shimmered in the moonlight, rippling faintly for the first time that night. Mia leaned closer, her reflection distorted in the water. Her breathing was shallow, her hands trembling. Something moved beneath the surface. Mia gasped and stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The surface of the lake rippled unnaturally, like something large was just beneath the water. "Elena!" she shouted, her voice sharp with panic. Elena scrambled out of the tent, groggy and irritated. "What's going on?" Mia pointed toward the lake, her hand trembling. "Something's in there. I saw it." Elena grabbed the flashlight from Mia's hand and shone it at the water, but the surface was still again, perfectly smooth, as if nothing had happened. "There's nothing there, Mia," Elena said with a sigh. "No, I saw something. It was moving." "It wasn't my imagination," Mia insisted, her voice rising. Elena hesitated, her face softening. "Maybe you're just tired. Come on, let's sit by the fire. The lake isn't going anywhere." Reluctantly, Mia followed Elena back to the fire, but she couldn't take her eyes off the water. Her heart still raced, and every small sound from the forest made her jump. "Do you think the stories are true?" Mia asked quietly, breaking the tense silence. Elena frowned. "What stories?" "The disappearances," Mia sighed, her voice barely above a whisper. "The people who went missing here." Elena rolled her eyes. "Come on, Mia, those are just urban legends. You know how people love to make up creepy stories about places like this." But Mia wasn't convinced. Something about the lake felt wrong, like it was alive, watching, waiting. Story 7. The Cabin's Secret. When Alex inherited the old family cabin deep in the woods, he wasn't sure what to do with it. The place had been abandoned for years, left to decay, after his grandfather passed away. But with no job and plenty of time on his hands, Alex decided to drive out and take a look. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The air smelled of damp earth and moss, and the only sound was the occasional chirp of a bird. "Not too bad," Alex muttered as he unlocked the heavy wooden door. It creaked open, revealing a dim interior coated in dust and cobwebs. The furniture was still. There a faded couch, a rickety wooden table, and a rocking chair that sat ominously in the corner. It felt like the place had been waiting for him. Alex spent the first day cleaning. He swept the floors, aired out the musty rooms, and even managed to patch a hole in the roof. By sunset, the cabin almost felt cozy. He lit a fire in the stone hearth and sat back with a cup of coffee, watching the flames dance. But as the night deepened, an unsettling feeling crept over him. The shadows cast by. The fire seemed too long, stretching unnaturally across the walls. And though the forest outside was silent, Alex thought he heard faint creaking sounds coming from upstairs. He laughed nervously. Just the house settling, he told himself. But deep down, he didn't believe it. Alex tried to shake off the unease and went to bed, but the creaking sounds didn't stop. They grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone or something was walking slowly across the floor above him. He stared at the ceiling, his heart pounding. "It's just the wind," he whispered, though there wasn't a single gust outside. Eventually, exhaustion won, and Alex drifted into a restless sleep. He woke up to the sound of a loud bang. Sitting bolt upright, Alex reached for the flashlight he'd left by the bed. His hands shook as he flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. No answer. Gathering his courage, Alex crept out of bed and into the hallway. The air was freezing, his breath visible in the faint light. The noise had come from upstairs. Each step Alex took felt heavier than the last. The creaks beneath his feet seemed to echo through the silent cabin, amplifying the tension. As he reached the base of the staircase, he paused, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The air felt different here, colder, almost suffocating. Slowly, he climbed the stairs, each step protesting under his weight. At the top, the hallway stretched out before him, its darkened doorways like gaping mouths. The noise had come from the guest bedroom at the end of the hall. He moved closer, his pulse pounding in his ears. Alex reached the door and hesitated. His hand hovered over the knob as he strained to hear anything on the other side. The silence was oppressive, broken only by his own shallow breathing. With a trembling hand, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The faint moonlight streaming through the window illuminated the sparse furniture, an old bed with a sagging mattress, a wooden chair in the corner, and a wardrobe whose door hung slightly ajar. Alex's flashlight beam swept across the room, stopping on the wardrobe. The creaking sound came again, this time from inside. Alex's throat went dry. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his feet remained planted as if rooted to the floor. The wardrobe door creaked slightly, opening just an inch wider. "Who's in there?" Alex demanded, his voice cracking. The flashlight beam wavered as his hands trembled. No answer. Summoning every ounce of courage, Alex approached the wardrobe. The air seemed to thicken with each step, and his heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear himself think. He reached out, fingers brushing the splintered wood of the wardrobe door. "Just open it," he whispered to himself, his breath shallow. Alex pulled the wardrobe door open with a swift motion, his flashlight's beam darting inside. For a moment, there was nothing, just old clothes hanging limply on a wooden rod. But then, something shifted in the shadows at the bottom. Alex jumped back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Who's there?" he shouted again, his voice echoing in the small room. A low groan emerged from the wardrobe, followed by a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging against the wooden floor. Alex steadied himself, shining the flashlight into the bottom of the wardrobe. The beam caught a glimpse of something too pale to be natural. It moved. Again, slowly, "Get out," Alex yelled, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. A guttural whisper filled the room, low and incomprehensible, like a voice speaking from underwater. The wardrobe began to creak, its wooden frame groaning as if straining under an immense weight. Alex stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering. The whisper grew louder, filling his ears, drowning out the pounding of his heart. The wardrobe burst open with a deafening crack. Alex screamed as the thing inside lunged forward, a pale, emaciated figure with hollow, black eyes and fingers twisted into claws. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, as if it didn't belong in this world. "Stay back!" Alex shouted, stumbling over the bed frame as he tried to retreat. The figure didn't speak. It loomed closer, the guttural whispers now filling the entire room, echoing in Alex's skull like a chorus of voices. Desperate, Alex swung the flashlight, the metal body striking the creature's outstretched hand. It shrieked a sound so piercing it felt like nails dragging down his spine. The creature recoiled, its shriek reverberating through the room. Alex seized the moment, bolting out of the door and slamming it shut behind him. As he stumbled down the stairs, the whispers followed, growing louder, more frantic. The walls seemed to close in, the very house groaning under the weight of an unseen force. Alex burst through the front door, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he ran into the forest. When he finally stopped to catch his breath, he turned back. The cabin was dark, silent, as if nothing had happened. But in the upstairs window, a pale face stared back at him, hollow eyes unblinking. Story 8. The whispering tree. Sophia had always been drawn to the woods. As a child, she would spend hours exploring the trails behind her grandparents' house, marveling at the towering trees and the way sunlight filtered through the canopy. But one tree stood out among the rest, a massive ancient oak with gnarled roots that twisted out of the ground like claws. Her grandmother had warned her to stay away from it. "That tree is cursed," she'd said, crossing herself. "People say they hear voices when they get too close. It's not natural." Sophia had laughed it off at the time, but now, years later, standing in front of the oak again, she felt the weight of her grandmother's words. The tree loomed over her, its branches stretching high into the sky like skeletal fingers. The air around it was still, too still. Not a single bird chirped, and the rustling of leaves seemed to stop just short of the clearing. Sophia had returned to her grandparents' house after their passing, tasked with cleaning out the property and preparing it for sale. The woods had called to her almost immediately, and she couldn't resist the pull. As she stepped closer to the oak, she noticed something strange. Carved into the bark were dozens of symbol spirals, jagged lines, and shapes that resembled eyes. A chill ran down her spine. She reached out to touch one of the carvings, her fingers brushing the rough bark, and then she heard it. A whisper, soft and faint, like a breath against her ear. Sophia froze, her hand still pressed against the bark. The whisper was faint, almost indistinguishable, but it was there, a low murmur, like someone speaking just out of earshot. "Hello?" She called out, her voice trembling. No reply. She took a step back, her eyes scanning the tree for any sign of what she'd just heard. The carving seemed to shift in the fading light, the jagged lines almost appearing deeper, as if freshly etched. Her heart raced as the whisper returned, louder this time. It wasn't words exactly, but something rhythmic, almost like chanting. The whispering grew louder as Sophia stepped closer to the tree, her curiosity battling with the knot of fear tightening in her stomach. The symbols carved into the bark seemed to pulse faintly, almost as if they were alive. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The chanting stopped. A cold breeze swept through the clearing, ruffling her hair and sending shivers down her spine. The air smelled of earth and decay, thick and suffocating. Just as Sophia turned to leave, a shadow moved small and quick near the base of the tree. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. The shadow moved again, darting behind one of the massive roots that clawed out of the ground. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice steadier this time, though her knees felt weak. No answer came, but the air grew colder, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. Slowly, she stepped closer to the tree, the crunch of leaves beneath her feet echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. As she rounded the root, her flashlight beam caught something, a bundle of fabric half buried in the dirt. Sophia crouched down, hesitant, Her flashlight beamed steady on the bundle. The fabric was weathered and stained, barely distinguishable from the dirt. It was buried in. She reached out with trembling fingers, tugging at the edge. As she pulled, a bone-white object rolled free, small and round. It took a moment for her brain to process what it was: a human skull. Sophia stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. The whispering returned, now louder and more insistent, as if the tree itself was alive and angry. Sophia scrambled to her feet, nearly tripping over the twisted roots as she backed away. The whispering grew into a cacophony, surrounding her, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Her flashlight flickered, the beam dimming with every passing second. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The symbols on the tree began to glow faintly, their pulsing light casting eerie shadows across the clearing. The whispers turned into words, low and guttural, in a language Sophia couldn't understand. Sophia stumbled backward as the glowing symbols pulsed faster, their light now illuminating the entire clearing. The guttural words grew louder, reverberating in her chest like a deep drumbeat. She turned to run, but the roots of the tree seemed to shift, curling and twisting as if trying to block her path. One root rose from the ground, its jagged surface scraping against her leg, causing her to fall hard onto the dirt. "No!" she screamed, clawing at the ground as the whispers became deafening. The skull she'd uncovered seemed to vibrate, rolling back toward the tree as if pulled by an invisible force. Sophia crawled backward, her hands clawing at the dirt as the tree seemed to come alive. The roots twisted and writhed, curling closer to her like serpents. The whispers grew louder still, piercing her mind, drowning out her thoughts. "Let me go!" she screamed, her voice barely audible over the deafening cacophony. The glowing symbols on the tree flared, bright enough to blind her. She squeezed her eyes shut, shielding her face with her hands. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went silent. When Sophia opened her eyes, the clearing was still again. The whispers were gone, the symbols dark, but the skull was gone, and the tree's roots were still shifting slightly, as if breathing. Sophia staggered to her feet, her body trembling as she stumbled out of the clearing. She didn't look back. The woods seemed darker now, the trees closing in around her. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf made her flinch, but she forced herself to keep moving, her breath ragged and shallow. When she finally reached her grandparents' house, she slammed the door shut and locked it, collapsing against it as tears streamed down her face. But the silence in the house felt wrong, too heavy, too still. And then she heard it again, the whisper. Story 9. The Vanishing Campfire. The plan was simple: a weekend camping trip to reconnect. Mark, Jenna, and their childhood friend Kyle hadn't seen each other in years, and the idea of escaping into the wilderness seemed perfect. No phones, no distractions, just the three of them and the great outdoors. They chose Ravenwood Forest, a sprawling expanse of dense trees and hidden trails, known for its beauty and its eerie reputation. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the disappearances over the years. Hikers who had ventured too far off the path and never returned. "It's just stories to keep people from littering," Kyle had joked, tossing his backpack into the car. But as they parked near the forest's edge and unloaded their gear, a strange unease settled over Mark. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The hike-in was uneventful, the trio laughing and reminiscing as they followed the trail deeper into the woods. They found a clearing near a small stream and set up camp. By dusk, the fire was crackling, and the smell of roasted marshmallows filled the air. "This is perfect," Jenna said, leaning back against a log. Mark nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows beyond the firelight seemed to move, shifting with the flickering flames. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked suddenly, sitting up straight. Kyle rolled his eyes. "Relax, man, it's just the wind." Mark didn't relax. The sound had been faint but distinct, like a twig snapping underfoot. He scanned the tree line, but the darkness beyond the campfire was impenetrable. "I'm serious," he said, his voice low. "It sounded like footsteps." Jenna frowned, sitting up. "I didn't hear anything." Kyle laughed, tossing a marshmallow into his mouth. "Dude, you've been watching too many horror movies." But then it came again. A crack, louder this time, like something heavy moving through the underbrush. Jenna grabbed the flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the night, illuminating nothing but trees and empty shadows. "Probably just an animal," Jenna said, though her voice wavered slightly. Mark wasn't convinced. The fire crackled softly, but the unease had settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Mark kept glancing toward the dark tree line, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. "Maybe we should just call it a night," he suggested, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Kyle groaned. "Mark, it's fine. We're in the middle of the woods, of course. You're gonna hear noises." But Jenna didn't argue. She grabbed her jacket and stood, brushing dirt off her jeans. "I'm with Mark. Let's just turn in." As the trio doused the fire and retreated to the tent, the forest grew eerily silent. Not a single cricket chirped, not a single branch rustled in the breeze. Mark lay awake in the tent, staring at the nylon ceiling as the others drifted off to sleep. The silence outside was oppressive, pressing against his ears like a physical weight. Then he heard it again, a faint rustling sound, followed by the unmistakable snap of a twig. His heart pounded as he strained to listen. "Jenna, Kyle," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Jenna stirred but didn't wake. Kyle snored softly. The sound grew louder, closer. Something or someone was circling the tent. Mark's breath hitched as a shadow passed over the tent, blotting out the faint moonlight. He reached for the small utility knife in his pack, clutching it tightly in his hand. The rustling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, something pressed against the tent wall, a faint, deliberate pressure, as though a hand or paw was testing the fabric. Mark couldn't move. His heart thundered in his chest as the outline of fingers appeared against the nylon. "Wake up," he hissed, shaking Jenna's shoulder. Jenna bolted upright, her eyes wide with fear as Mark gestured toward the tent wall. The shadow of fingers remained, pressing against the fabric. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Kyle snorted awake, muttering groggily, "What's going on?" Before Mark could answer, the pressure on the tent disappeared, leaving only the faint rustle of movement outside. "We have to see what it is," Jenna said, grabbing the flashlight with shaking hands. "No, we stay here," Mark hissed. But Jenna was already unzipping the tent, the flashlight's beam slicing through the darkness. Jenna's flashlight swept across the campsite, illuminating the trees and the remains of the extinguished fire. The clearing appeared empty, but Mark's heart pounded as he strained to see past the beam's reach. "See? There's nothing," Jenna began, but then they heard it again, a low guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Kyle scrambled out of the tent, wide-eyed. What was that? The sound grew louder, closer, vibrating in their chests like the growl of something enormous. Mark gripped the knife tighter, his knuckles white. The growling stopped suddenly, replaced by an unsettling silence. Jenna kept the flashlight steady, her hands shaking. "We need to leave," Mark said, his voice firm. Kyle nodded, his bravado gone. "Yeah, this isn't funny anymore." As they began packing their gear in frantic silence, a deep, resonating laugh echoed through the forest, sending chills down their spines. The laugh was inhuman, distorted, and seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Run!" Mark yelled. Mark, Jenna, and Kyle bolted into the forest, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they stumbled over roots and fallen branches. The laughter followed them, growing louder, closer, until it felt like it was inside their heads. "Keep running!" Mark shouted, though his legs burned with exhaustion. Kyle tripped, falling hard onto the ground. Jenna stopped, grabbing his arm to pull him up. But as she turned to look behind them, her scream pierced the night. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, impossibly thin, with glowing eyes that burned like embers. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth, as if it were gliding over the ground. The laughter ceased, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. "Get up!" Mark yelled, yanking Kyle to his feet. They took off again, but Jenna hesitated, frozen by the glowing eyes that seemed to burn straight into her soul. Mark grabbed her arm, snapping her out of her trance. "We have to go." The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and bending as if alive. The path back to the car was gone, swallowed by the shifting landscape. And then, the laughter returned, echoing in every direction. Story 10. The trail that never ends. Lena wasn't supposed to be hiking alone. It was one of the first rules of the Green Hollow Trail, a 10-mile loop notorious for its dense woods and unpredictable weather. But after her friends bailed on her at the last minute, she decided to go anyway. "It's just one trail," she muttered to herself, tightening the straps of her backpack. "I'll be back by sunset." The entrance to Green Hollow was marked by a weathered wooden sign, the words almost unreadable beneath layers of moss. Beyond it, the trail disappeared into a tunnel of towering pines. Lena hesitated. Something about the stillness of the forest felt off, but she shook it off, determined not to let fear ruin her day. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail wound gently through the woods, sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden streaks. Lena hummed to herself, enjoying the solitude. But as she reached the halfway point, something strange happened. The trail forked into two paths, something the map hadn't shown. Lena unfolded the map, her brow furrowing. There was no mention of a fork, just one continuous path that looped back to the entrance. She glanced at both trails. The one on the left was overgrown, the dirt path barely visible beneath a tangle of weeds. The one on the right seemed well worn, the dirt packed down by countless footsteps. Instinct told her to take the right path. It looked safer, but something about the left trail pulled at her, a strange, almost magnetic feeling. After a moment of hesitation, she stepped toward the left path. The air grew colder as Lena ventured down the left trail, the canopy above thickening until only slivers of light peeked through. The quietness was unnerving, no birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of her boots on the dirt. She kept glancing over her shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. After walking for what felt like hours, she stopped. The path had curved sharply, bringing her face to face with something she couldn't explain. A second wooden sign, identical to the one at the trailhead. It read, "Welcome to Green Hollow." Lena's stomach dropped. She stared at the sign, her mind racing. How could she have looped back to the start without realizing it? She turned, looking back down the path she had just taken. It stretched into the distance, the dense trees swallowing the view. There was no way she had walked in a circle. Taking a deep breath, she decided to keep moving. Maybe this was just a mistake, a duplicate sign placed somewhere along the trail. But as she continued, the unsettling feeling only grew. The path twisted and turned, the trees growing closer together until Lena had to duck under low-hanging branches. The air grew colder still, and the light filtering through the canopy dimmed, casting everything in a grayish hue. And then she saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the trail ahead, motionless. It was too far away to make out details, but it was unmistakably human. "Hello?" Lena called, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Lena's heart raced as she took a cautious step forward. The figure remained still, its silhouette faint in the dim light. "Are you okay?" She called again, her voice echoing eerily through the trees. This time, the figure moved just slightly, a tilt of the head as if acknowledging her presence. Lena froze. Something was wrong. The way it moved was unnatural, too smooth, like a puppet on strings. She took a step back, and the figure took a step forward. "Stop!" Lena shouted, her voice cracking. The figure paused, its head tilting to the other side, as if studying her. Without thinking, Lena turned and bolted back down the path. Her legs burned as she sprinted, branches tearing at her clothes and face. But no matter how far she ran, the trail ahead remained the same, twisting, endless, leading her nowhere. The sound of footsteps behind her grew louder, quicker. Whatever it was chasing her. Lena's breath came in ragged, gasps as she pushed herself harder, her muscles screaming in protest. She dared a glance over her shoulder, but saw nothing, just the empty trail stretching endlessly behind her. The footsteps suddenly stopped. She skidded to a halt, her chest heaving as she strained to listen. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the pounding of her heart. "Hello?" She called again, her voice barely above a whisper. And then, from the shadows, a voice whispered back, "You're almost there." Lena's knees nearly buckled. The voice was soft, almost kind, but something about it felt wrong and human. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to steady her breathing. There was no answer, only the rustling of leaves as a cold wind swept through the trees. The path ahead seemed darker now, the trail disappearing into shadows. "Almost where?" she whispered to herself, clutching the straps of her backpack. And then she saw it. Just ahead, faintly glowing in the distance, was a doorway, an arch made of twisting branches, its frame shimmering faintly. Lena's hands trembled as she approached the glowing arch. The air around it felt charged, humming faintly like static electricity. She could feel the pull again, stronger this time, like an invisible hand guiding her forward. "Don't," she whispered to herself, but her feet moved on their own. As she stepped closer, the whispers returned, soft, overlapping voices that she couldn't understand. They seemed to be coming from the arch itself, beckoning her. She stopped just short of the threshold, staring into the swirling darkness beyond. "Do I go through?" she thought, her mind racing. But before she could decide, a cold hand grabbed her shoulder. Lena froze as the cold hand tightened on her shoulder. She didn't dare turn around. The whispers from the arch grew louder, overlapping into an indecipherable chorus, as if urging her forward. Her instincts screamed to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Slowly, the hand released her, and a soft voice, closer, now whispered directly into her ear, "Go." Lena stumbled forward, crossing the threshold before she could stop herself. The world around her shifted instantly. The forest vanished, replaced by an endless expanse of darkness. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the whispers became deafening. "Hello?" she shouted, her voice swallowed by the void. And then she saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, their eyes glowing faintly. They surrounded her, their movements unnatural, their mouths moving in perfect unison as they whispered, "Welcome to Green Hollow." Lena tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was her own reflection in their glowing eyes, frozen in terror. The next morning, hikers found the trailhead deserted, with a single wooden sign freshly carved, "Welcome to Green Hollow." One more added, and there you have it, 10 stories that remind us why the wilderness is both mesmerizing and terrifying. From haunting voices in the night to trails that lead nowhere, these tales tap into our deepest fears of the unknown. But the question remains, what would you do in these situations? Would you push forward, defy the fear, or turn back and never speak of it again? The forest, the campsite, the lonely trail, all of these places hold secrets, waiting for the next brave or unlucky soul to uncover them. Perhaps it's better to leave some mysteries unsolved. If these stories sent a chill down your spine or made you think twice about your next camping trip, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who loves a good scare. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button for more terrifying tales that will keep you up at night. Remember, the next time you venture into the wilderness, listen carefully. You might just hear the whispers of those who came before you.